Jay Williams, the number 2 pick in the NBA Draft 2002, the face that millions of Americans trust every morning on ESPN. A man who has redefined the meaning of getting back up after losing everything. From the bright lights of Cameron Indoor Stadium to the national television analyst chair, he has conquered two completely different stages with discipline, faith, and a will that never allows himself to stay down on the ground for too long. Millions of people admire him as a symbol of rebirth and extraordinary resilience. But behind that inspiring story is a harsh and unglamorous truth. A childhood crushed under the weight of expectations. One summer night in 2003 that took everything away in a few seconds. Years of addiction and depression in a room no one was allowed to look into. Twice he reached the edge of not wanting to continue living, and the silent fear that he would forever be the shadow of the person he was once promised to become. And now, at 44 years old, when the scars on his body have faded, but the scars in his mind are still there, what really happened to Jay Williams on that June night, and in the dark years behind it, that the world has never known? Painfully, the truth behind a familiar smile on television is not light but darkness. That is where Jay Williams's lifelong battle with pain and faith began. He was born on September 10, 1981 in Plainfield, New Jersey, a small city where the lines between rich and poor and skin color were clearly visible on every street. His mother, Althea, worked non-stop to raise her child. His father, David, was strict and disciplined, believing that love was shown through expectations rather than praise. Inside their small house, there were training sessions before sunrise, but hugs were rare. And that is where Jay Williams' real story began, long before the whole of America knew this name. If his story has ever made you think about your own life, about a time you fell and had to wonder if you could stand up, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you do not miss stories like this, stories about how people are truly forged in the darkness that no one sees. Sadly, the foundation of a legend was not built with warmth but with iron discipline and silent fear of failure. Plainfield, New Jersey, in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, was a city clearly divided to the point that a black child could see that line with his own young eyes, without anyone needing to explain it. One side was the streets where hope still flickered, where people believed there was some door, even if narrow, still open. One side was the streets where dreams had died before the child was even born, where the future was only an empty word mentioned in church sermons. Jay Williams grew up right on that line, and from a very young age he understood, in a way no child should have to understand too soon, that the direction his life would take depended on whether he was good enough or not. His father, David Williams, and his mother, Althea, loved their son in the way of people who had survived so much that they could no longer believe in simple gentleness. Their love was not praise or sudden hugs. Their love was discipline. It was the constant reminder that the world out there would never forgive weakness, that their son must always be one level above others, must always be better than himself from yesterday, must always prove that he deserved the opportunity that not everyone born in Plainfield had. Jay did not grow up with memories of carefree afternoons wandering with friends, of purposeless, childish mischief. His childhood memories were early mornings. When the sun had not yet risen, the boy was already out on the court, alone, shooting the ball over and over, because that was the only way he knew to deserve the love he was receiving in that small house. Around him, other children in Plainfield were walking on different paths, and Jay saw that from very early on, earlier than any child should have to see. Some of his classmates would end up behind bars. Some would disappear in ways that people never spoke about at the dinner table. And the boy Jay stood in the middle, realizing that his path had been split long before he could choose for himself, and the burden of always having to go the right way weighed on his small shoulders like a nameless stone, something no one saw but was always there. What very few people have ever told is that the expectations came not only from his parents. They came from the whole community, from the teachers on the school court, from the neighbors, watching the boy run by every morning, from the eyes of all the adults in Plainfield when they looked at Jay Williams and saw in him a future they themselves had never reached. And the burden of becoming the hope for an entire community when he himself was not yet big enough to carry the hope for himself was something that left a silent wound, a kind of wound that never bled but also never truly healed. There were nights after a loss. The boy Jay sat alone in the darkness of his small room, not crying, because he had learned early that tears were a luxury he did not have the right to own. He just sat there, his hands gripping the orange ball tightly like gripping a promise to himself, and whispering in his head, repeating over and over, "Next time must be better, must always be better." And in those quiet nights, there was a question the boy carried throughout his growing up years but never dared to say out loud, not even as a whisper to himself in the mirror. If one day I am no longer good, will any of the people who love me now still stay? It is truly regrettable when a soul born to contain many things is forced by the world to shrink down to only one single thing. Few people know that Jay Williams was not born just to play basketball. The boy was once the best volleyball player in the state of New Jersey. In his senior year of high school, once sat for hours in front of a chessboard, moving each piece with the patience of a child older than his years, once ran on the grass in his school's soccer team in ninth grade. Inside that boy was a multidimensional soul, curious, eager to learn, unwilling to be confined to any single mold. But the world around him, little by little, only wanted to see one single thing. And the way the other parts of him gradually disappeared was not because someone ordered him to abandon them. No one ever directly told Jay to quit chess, to quit volleyball. They quietly disappeared on their own, year by year, under the weight of an increasingly dense training schedule, under the pressure of consecutive competitions, under the increasingly heavy eyes of expectation from the people around him, until there was no room left in a teenager's life for anything else besides that orange ball. At St. Joseph High School in Metuchen, he was called by the affectionate name J. Dubs, sounding gentle and close, like a nickname among friends. But along with that name was a burden that not every 16 or 17-year-old child had the strength to carry: fame that came too soon. His name appeared on national sports pages when he had not even finished learning how to drive. Jay Williams' senior high school season was a list of numbers that left people stunned. Averaging 19 points per game, 7 assists, a grade point average of 3.6, McDonald's All-American honors, parade All-American honors. From the outside, it was a perfect picture without a single scratch. A teenager who seemed to have everything within reach. But inside that picture was a child gradually losing the ability to clearly distinguish between who he was and who he was trying to be for others, between what he really wanted and what he thought he had to achieve so as not to disappoint anyone. The night Jay Williams received the scholarship news from Duke University was not a night of pure joy, as people usually imagine for a boy who had just touched his dream. It was a strange feeling of relief, like the feeling of someone who had just escaped something heavy. Even though he himself did not fully understand what he had just escaped, and was not sure whether Duke was truly the destination he wanted, or simply the next stop on a journey where no one had ever stopped to ask his opinion, even once. The evening before the day of officially signing the commitment, Jay sat alone in his small room, looking up at the certificates and medals covering the walls, and felt a hard-to-name strangeness. Those things bore his name, were the results of his own hands and feet, but he could not say for sure that they truly said anything about the person he was, or were simply proof of what others wanted to see in him. Also around that time, a close friend once asked him a simple question he never forgot. If there was no basketball, what would you want to do? Jay Williams, 18 years old, standing at the threshold of one of the most prestigious basketball programs in America, had no answer. And that silence, that strange emptiness behind the seemingly simple question, would silently follow him for 20 years later, waiting for the day it would be answered in circumstances that no one could then imagine. Sadly, the place once seen as a paradise for a teenager became the golden cage that imprisoned his true self. Cameron Indoor Stadium was known as the Holy Land of American college basketball, where the lights shining down on the polished wooden floor had been soaked with the sweat of dozens of generations of legends, where the cheers of thousands of passionate fans could make the ground shake. And Jay Williams, 18 years old, stepped into that space for the first time with the feeling that he was born just to stand there, as if his whole life up to that point had only been the prelude to this moment. In his first year, freshman year, he won the ACC Rookie of the Year award, averaging 15.5 points per game, an achievement no freshman at Duke had ever achieved before. But that was only the beginning. In his sophomore year, the 2000 to 2001 season, Jay Williams led the Duke team to the National NCAA Championship, 841 points in one season, breaking a record that had existed for 49 years, averaging 25.7 points per game in the tournament. The number 22 jersey began to carry a completely different meaning. No longer just a number on the back of a young player, but the opening signature for a legend being written day by day on that court. In his junior year, the 2001 to 2002 season, Jay Williams received both of the most prestigious awards for the best college basketball player in America, the Naismith Award and the Wooden Award. And then something that had never happened before happened. His number 22 jersey was permanently hung from the ceiling of Cameron Indoor Stadium, while he was still a student, still wearing that jersey every weekend. Head coach Mike Krzyzewski, the man the entire basketball world called by the familiar name Coach K, had a philosophy he taught to all his players. Next play, the next ball. Do not look back at the mistake just made. Do not be complacent with the beautiful play just performed. There is only one thing that exists. That is the next moment. Always moving forward, never stopping. That philosophy, many years later, would become what saved Jay Williams in the darkest days of his life. But at this moment, when he was only 20 years old, that very philosophy was also what stopped him long enough to ask himself a simple but important question. Am I really okay? Because when you are seen as the best player in America, no one stops to ask how you are feeling. People only want to see you play ball, only want to see you score points, only want to witness the legend continue to be written. And the price of that perfection is a nameless loneliness, unseen because it is hidden behind the brilliant numbers. On the night the Duke team won the NCAA championship in 2001, when the final whistle sounded, when teammates hugged each other in a sea of confetti and cheers, Jay Williams, after the stadium lights gradually went out and the crowd had dispersed, sat alone on the wooden floor in the remaining dim darkness, and in his head rang a question he never dared say out loud to anyone. Is this really what I want, or is this just what everyone wants me to want? And when standing under the ceiling of Cameron Indoor Stadium, looking up at his own number 22 jersey being pulled up high, hung permanently next to other legendary names, the feeling flooding through him was not pride as people imagine. It was fear. A silent, cold fear, because he understood that from the moment his name was hung on that wall, he would never again be allowed to be an ordinary person, never again be allowed to fail, to doubt, to simply be a 20-year-old guy trying to figure out who he really was amid all the expectations weighing on those still too young shoulders. Memorably, it was the moment a young man stood at the peak of the American dream, not knowing that fate was preparing the most brutal lesson of his life. On the night of June 26, 2002, at Madison Square Garden, New York, his name rang out over the loudspeaker. The Chicago Bulls select Jason Williams from Duke University, the second overall pick in the NBA draft, only behind Yao Ming. In that moment, the world beneath Jay Williams' feet expanded endlessly, as if every door he had ever knocked on, every training night before dawn in Plainfield, Every drop of sweat poured onto the Cameron Indoor Stadium wooden floor had finally led to this very second. Right when stepping into the NBA world, he was asked to change his name from Jason to Jay to avoid confusion with two other players with the same name playing in the league at that time. A small detail, almost meaningless to anyone following at the time, but looking back, it was the first silent omen that right when stepping into the professional world, he was forced to redefine himself once again, according to conditions not set by him. The Bulls assigned him the locker in the locker room that once belonged to Michael Jordan, the greatest man who had ever worn this team's jersey. The first time sitting in front of that wooden locker, 21 years old, the feeling surging in him was not excitement as people imagine, but a silent overwhelm, like standing before a shadow too big that he was not sure if he had the strength to fill. The signed contract worth $16 million, a number that his parents, people who had worked hard their whole lives in Plainfield, had never dared to dream of in their most extravagant dreams. A number big enough to make a 21-year-old guy believe he was immortal, that there were no limits, no doors closed, no consequences that could touch him anymore. The rookie season of 2002 to 2003 was not perfect but full of promise. There were nights he struggled to find rhythm, but there were also nights he shone brightly, like the game against the New Jersey Nets when he recorded a triple-double that stunned the whole city of Chicago. At the end of the season, he was honored on the all-rookie second team. Chicago, a city desperately craving a new star after the Jordan era, began to give him the love previously reserved only for legends. And then summer came. The contract was safely in the bank. His career was opening up before him like a straight road with no end. And in the garage of his Chicago apartment, a red and black Yamaha YZF-R6 motorcycle, powerful and shiny, was waiting. That was the feeling of a 21-year-old standing on top of the world, the most dangerous feeling a person can carry within themselves, the feeling of immortality. The night before that fateful summer truly began, Jay Williams sat alone in his Chicago apartment, looking out the window, watching the city lights sparkling stretching to the horizon. And for the first time in his life, he felt everything was in the right place, just as it should be. He had no idea that was the last peaceful night before everything collapsed. Many years later, when looking back at that moment, he would say a sentence that anyone who has ever heard it must fall silent. I thought I had reached the destination. It turned out I had not even begun to understand life at all. Quietly and terrifyingly is the only way to describe the final weeks before fate struck, when no one, not even himself, realized that the storm was silently gathering right beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect life. Chicago in the summer of 2003 was hot, vibrant, and for a 21-year-old NBA star with a $1 million contract in hand, it was a city where no doors were closed, no one dared say no to him, no limits really existed beyond what he set for himself. The red and black Yamaha YZF-R6 motorcycle in the garage of his apartment was not bought just for a simple hobby of speed machines. It was bought because of a much deeper need, a thirst for sensation he could not name. The only sensation besides holding the orange ball that made him feel he was truly alive. This is a detail that very few people stop to ponder. When a person's identity is built entirely on one single thing, when the whole world only defines you by what you can do on the court, you will not stop seeking stronger, more risky sensations. To prove to yourself that there is still some real person existing beneath the professional athlete's jersey. In the contract with the Chicago Bulls, there was a clear clause prohibiting riding motorcycles, a protective clause that any player had to sign. Jay Williams signed it, but he did not really listen to the true meaning behind those lines. At 21 years old, standing on top of the world, no one really believed that an accident would happen to them. That was an unwritten rule of youth and imagined invincibility. There were nights when the city had fallen asleep, he alone rode that motorcycle on the empty highways of Chicago, wind whistling in his ears, speed blurring all thoughts, darkness swallowing all boundaries, and in that moment, he felt no one could touch him anymore. That was exactly when he felt the freest in his entire life, free from the expectations that had weighed on him since childhood, free from the pressure to always be the best, free from the name Jay Williams that the whole city of Chicago was watching with every step. What very few people know, what has never been mentioned in any newspaper, is that he had many nights riding like that before, many times alone, rushing into the darkness without anyone knowing. The night of June 19th was not the first time. It was simply the last time. There is an image that later, when he had enough courage to look back, he never forgot. The moment sitting on the motorcycle saddle in the dark garage, before starting the engine to ride into that fateful night, he glanced into the small rearview mirror attached to the handlebars, and in it was a face he did not fully recognize. Not Jay Williams, the Duke legend, the one with the number 22 jersey, permanently hung from the Cameron Indoor Stadium ceiling. Just a 21-year-old guy, running away from something simmering inside that he himself had never found a name for. Cruelly, fate never warns with thunder or storms, but chooses the most ordinary summer evening to take everything away. On the evening of June 19th, 2003, Jay Williams was on his way to a friend's house for dinner. Nothing unusual, no sign foreshadowing what was about to happen. It was not a stormy, rainy night, not a time of losing control while drunk, just a calm summer evening in Chicago, and that cruel ordinariness was what made what happened afterward harder to accept than ever. On Belmont Avenue, right in the Roscoe Village area, a streetlight pole appeared in his sight. Many years later, when he had enough courage to tell it, he only said briefly, "I saw it." But it was too late. There is no way to describe the moment of collision with ordinary action words, because for him it was not a sequence of events, but a whirlwind of chaotic sensations. The sound of metal grinding, darkness suddenly rushing in like someone had just switched off a light, the cold asphalt pressing against his cheek, and then a strange, almost peaceful silence, before the real pain hit like a giant wave swallowing his entire body. Lying there, on the grass strip between the curb and the sidewalk, blood quietly flowing from inside his body that he himself did not know the severity of, the first sentence that escaped his mouth was not a cry for help, not anyone's name. It was a single sentence, broken between ragged breaths. "I threw it all away." Not a lament. It was the cruelest realization that a 21-year-old had ever had to face in a single second of his life. The list of injuries that the doctors recorded afterward read like an indictment of fate. The femoral artery severed, causing internal bleeding threatening his life directly. The pelvis fractured with a wound about 13 centimeters long. Similar to what happens in a difficult birth, the peroneal nerve completely severed, leading to permanent foot drop. 3 of the 4 main ligaments in the left knee, torn including the anterior cruciate ligament, and more than 100 stitches to reconstruct what could still be saved. In the first hours in the emergency room, the doctors even considered the possibility of amputating his leg. There is a detail that for many years, almost no one mentioned, because it was too private, too painful to make public. The pelvic injury was so severe that the doctor frankly told him that the possibility of him being able to have children in the future was extremely slim. A 21-year-old man, lying alone in a hospital room filled with the smell of disinfectant, hearing the steady beep of the heart monitor in his ear, receiving that news with no one by his side to hold his hand. 1 week after the accident, the Chicago Bulls selected Kirk Hinrich in the new draft, filling the position that should have been his. 2 weeks later, the team officially terminated the contract with him. They gave him $3 million to cover recovery costs, a not small amount of money, but not a single dollar of it could buy back what he had just lost. The moment he woke up in the recovery room after the first surgery was one of the clearest memories he still held. The stark white ceiling, the cold fluorescent lights shining down, the medical machines beeping steadily around him, And the strange thing was that, in that moment, he did not think about his collapsing career, did not think about the $16 million contract that had just vanished, did not think about what people would write about him in the newspapers the next day. The only thought that crept into his mind, hazy from painkillers, was simply, "How will my mother receive this news?" In the hours after that, as he lay motionless, eyes staring fixedly at the white ceiling for hours without blinking, he gradually realized a truth even more terrifying than any physical wound. For the first time in his 21 years of life, he did not know who he was if he was no longer a basketball player. And that was the real injury, deeper than any ligament tear, heavier than any pelvic fracture. It lay in that unanswered question, a question that would haunt him for many dark months ahead, longer than anyone could imagine when looking at his confident smile in the newspapers in the days after. Gloomy and suffocating are two words still too light to describe what Jay Williams went through during the 2.5 months lying in the hospital bed when the outside world continued to turn without once looking back at him. From June to August 2003, he lay in a hospital in Chicago, then was transferred to Duke University Medical Center for continued treatment. Meanwhile, out there, the basketball summer was more vibrant than ever, with the free agency market, with million-dollar contracts being signed, with young stars preparing to step into the biggest spotlight of their careers. But inside the hospital room where he lay, time seemed to have completely stopped, frozen in a single moment, stretching endlessly. He could not stand up on his own until September, October of that year. Later, when he had enough courage to look back, he told about that period with a sentence so stark that it left listeners silent. "Yesterday, I was still dunking right over Yao Ming's head. Today, a woman has to help me bathe." There was not a bit of self-pity in the way he recounted it, only the starkest truth that anyone must bow their head before it. In the first days after the accident, his hospital room was crowded with visitors, flowers, get-well cards, words of encouragement overflowing. But then, day by day, that stream of people thinned out. Friends returned to their own lives. Teammates entered the new season with games, flights, dense schedules that did not allow them to stop for too long beside someone lying motionless. And Jay lay there, day after day, in a room that became increasingly empty and silent. There were evenings when he turned on the TV on the wall to watch the 2003 NBA draft ceremony, witnessing LeBron James selected first overall, Dwyane Wade in fifth position, Chris Bosh in fourth position, young faces of the same generation as him stepping into the very world where he should have been there too, standing on that stage, wearing the New Jersey colors, receiving the camera flashes and applause. He turned off the TV, but the sound of applause still echoed in his head for many nights afterward, impossible to turn off. During this period, he began to be prescribed strong painkillers like Delodid and morphine. Completely legal, completely medically necessary, no one on the care team saw it as a worrying problem. But his body, little by little, began to remember the pleasant feeling those doses brought in ways that no one could foresee the consequences at the time. Amid all that emptiness and loss, there was one presence that never left: his mother, Mrs. Althea, sitting by the hospital bed for many hours every day. She did not say much. She just sat there, quietly, sometimes holding his hand, sometimes just watching him sleep. And that silent presence, without any flowery words of comfort, was precisely the only thing keeping him from completely sinking in those darkest days. The first night he was truly alone in the hospital, when visiting hours ended and the sound of footsteps in the hallway gradually thinned out and then disappeared completely. He lay there, eyes wide open, looking up at the ceiling, and for the first time in his 21 years of life, he realized he had no plans at all for tomorrow. No early morning training, no game to prepare for, nothing at all. Only the thick darkness in the room and the steady beeping of the heart monitor sounding like a cold reminder that he was still alive, even though he himself was not sure if that still had any meaning anymore. And there was a moment When the nurses first removed the bandages for him to see his leg after the surgery, the feeling surging in him was not horror as people think. It was a strangely alien feeling, like looking at something that no longer belonged to his body anymore, like looking at a complete stranger lying in the reflection of a mirror, a person with his face but no longer the him from before. The darkest part of this entire journey is the period that the outside world calls by the gentle name recovering. While inside those silent walls, Jay Williams was gradually sinking into a place that no news report dared to call by its true name. The legally prescribed painkillers in the hospital, Dilaudid then morphine, gradually turned into OxyContin and oxycodone, lasting for 4 full years, from a legitimate medical treatment method into an addiction that even he himself did not realize when he had crossed the boundary. That was not weakness, even though later some people accidentally or intentionally called it that. That was the natural reaction of a body enduring pain beyond human limits, and a mind gradually sliding into a bottomless pit that he had never been taught how to escape from. Everyone wants to escape pain, and at that time, medication was the only way he knew. Parallel to that was alcohol, nights of drinking until he could no longer feel anything, a dark loop that kept repeating without end. Waking up only to hope he would not wake up, drinking so as not to have to feel, sleeping so as not to have to face himself while awake. But physical pain, no matter how brutal, was still not what tormented him the most. There was a question that kept haunting him every hour, every minute, without an answer for many years. When I am no longer a basketball player, who am I? The emptiness from that question eroded him from the inside in a way unlike any physical wound he had ever endured. He began to fear meeting old acquaintances, fear stepping out the door, fear seeing in the eyes of the person opposite him not the person standing in front of them, but only the shadow of a legend that once existed. The media continued to call him by the familiar phrase, the former star on the road to recovery. But behind the closed door of that room, he was not recovering at all. He was sinking day by day, quietly and unnoticed by anyone. In the interviews and in the memoir that many years later he had enough courage to write, he publicly shared that there were 2 times during that dark period when he reached the edge of no longer wanting to continue living. The first time happened after a long period of exhaustion both physically and mentally, when he could no longer find any reason big enough to keep trying. And then his mother, Mrs. Althea, walked into the room. She did not say anything in the first moment. She just quietly sat down next to her son. Then she spoke, gently to the point it was almost just a breath. "Son, Mom is here." Those 3 words were lighter than air, but heavier than anything else in life, strong enough to pull him back from the edge he was standing on. The second time happened after his first attempt to return to the court failed completely. When his body once again said no, when the last door leading back to basketball slammed shut in front of him. The feeling at that time was no longer simply failure. It was an absolute emptiness, with nothing left to hold on to. During the darkest period, Coach Mike Krzyzewski, his former teacher at Duke, called him. He did not ask about basketball, did not ask about plans to return to the court. He only asked one simple question: "Are you okay?" And for the first time in his life, Jay Williams did not answer, "okay." He stayed silent. The silence stretching across that phone line was the most honest answer he had ever given to anyone. The way out of the darkness did not come in the form of a heroic moment or a sudden enlightening decision. It came from a mentor named Charles Grantham, who asked him a seemingly simple question that changed everything. Who is on the board of directors of Jay Williams' life? That question was like the first ray of light sneaking into a room that had been dark for too long. Not enough to illuminate every corner, but enough for him to realize that that room was not made entirely of darkness. The decision to seek psychological therapy afterward was not a heroic moment painted beautifully. It was the decision of a person who was too tired to continue fighting alone. And sometimes, that very decision, the decision to admit he needed help, was the bravest action a person could take. There were mornings during the darkest period when he woke up, looked up at the ceiling, and could not find a reason big enough to get out of bed. Then the phone rang. It was his mother calling, and he got up, not because he himself wanted to, but because he did not want to make his mother worry one more time. That was how he survived those days and months, not by any extraordinary strength, but by very small reasons. His mother's phone call ringing at the right time, a cup of still warm coffee on the table. A beautiful sunny afternoon slipping through the window frame, reminding him that the world out there still existed. And perhaps, one day, he would find his way back to it, fragile like a candle in the wind, but still burning. That is the only way to describe the moment the first light sneaked back into Jay Williams' life, coming at a time he least expected and from a place he never imagined. 1 year after the accident, he was still limping, still had to wear the leg brace every day, and still had absolutely no idea what he would do with the rest of his life, a part of life he had never learned how to imagine without the orange ball in his hands. The decision to return to Duke to help coach a summer basketball camp for children did not stem from courage or any clear goal. It was simply that he no longer knew where else to go. And perhaps, deep down, a very small part of him still wanted to see that wooden court once more, the place where he had given everything he had when he was still himself in those glorious days. Cameron Indoor Stadium that day did not have thousands of passionate fans, did not have cheers shaking the roof. There were only children running and jumping, and the steady sound of balls bouncing on the wooden floor. Standing on the very court where his name had once been hung permanently from the ceiling, with the leg brace clearly visible under his pants, Jay Williams at that moment was no longer a legend to anyone. He was just a man trying to stand straight. Among the children playing, there was a little boy who approached him, big round eyes clear, who had never known the concept of fear or hesitation. The boy asked in an eager voice, "You are my favorite player. Are you going to play again?" And for the first time since the accident, for the first time since stepping out of the four walls of those dark rooms, Jay Williams told the truth to someone. He bent down to look at the boy and answered, "I do not think that is going to happen. It is time for me to find another path," the boy cried, not sobbing lightly. It was real crying, tears rolling down his small cheeks, unrestrained, unembarrassed. Then the boy wiped his tears with the back of his hand, looked straight into Jay Williams' eyes, and said with all the sincerity of a child who had never learned to lie, "You cannot give up. You are not allowed to give up." In that moment, a man who had experienced much, who had faced death, who carried burdens that no child in that room could imagine, was saved by that very child who had no idea what he had just done. It was not that the child needed Jay Williams. It was Jay Williams who needed that child, needed that unadorned, straightforward words, needed to be reminded that there were still people who believed in him, even though he was no longer the person they once knew. When driving out of the Duke campus that afternoon, the feeling in him was not excitement, let alone a feeling of victory. It was just a strange, vague but real feeling. For the first time in a very long time, he no longer felt completely empty, just a little bit. But even that little bit was enough. That evening, he did not call anyone. He just sat alone in the car, parked in the quiet parking lot of Duke, looking out into the darkness ahead, and cried. Not because of pain like the times before, but because for the first time after a long stretch of time, he felt that inside himself there was still something that wanted to live, that wanted to continue, that wanted to reach for something, even though he himself did not yet know what that was. Calm but painful. That is the only way to describe the years Jay Williams tried to find his way back to the only thing he had ever known as himself, and the way he gradually learned that there are doors, once closed, that will never open again, no matter how hard you knock. He sought out Tim Grover, the legendary strength coach who had worked with Michael Jordan, and began training days lasting 10 to 12 hours, day after day. Morning physical therapy, noon Pilates, afternoon basketball skill exercises. From a person who could not even touch the rim, he gradually progressed to the point where he could jump over a 40-inch obstacle. His body was coming back, little by little, full of pain and patience. But it was no longer his old body. It was a body rebuilt from fragments, carrying limits that even he himself did not fully understand. 4 years after the accident, he had the opportunity to meet and try out with 6 different NBA teams. A faint, fragile ray of hope, but big enough to pull him out of bed every morning throughout those grueling months. In 2006, the New Jersey Nets gave him a non-guaranteed contract, allowing him to play in 6 preseason games. But his legs, although significantly recovered, were no longer the legs of a 21-year-old. Heavy like 8,000 pounds, he would say that many years later when recalling that feeling, no longer quick, no longer explosive like before. The Nets decided not to keep him. He continued to try his luck with the Austin Toros in the NBA lower league, hoping this would be the last door leading him back to the peak. But after only 3 games, he tore his hamstring and severely strained his groin. This time, everything truly ended. There were no more doors left to knock on. The night after being let go by the Toros, he did not cry. He also did not angrily smash anything. He just sat quietly in the car, hands on the steering wheel, looking forward through the foggy windshield, and realized that he had known this for a very long time. Only, he had never had enough courage to admit it to himself. There is a thin line between giving up and accepting, 2 concepts that look exactly the same from the outside but are completely different inside a person's mind. Jay Williams did not give up. He accepted what his body had been trying to tell him for a very long time. Through every pain, every exhaustion, every limit that could not be overcome no matter how hard he tried, and learning to listen to his body instead of forcing it to obey his will was the most painful lesson he had ever had to learn in his entire life. That night, he called his mother. His voice was tired, empty. "Mom, I am done." Mrs. Althea stayed silent for a long time over the phone line, then gently replied, "No, son, you have only just begun." At that time, he did not believe his mother's words. But he also no longer had the strength to argue or contradict anything. A few days later, in his small room, he picked up his last pair of game shoes, the pair that had accompanied him through the final games of the dream of returning, put them into the bag, and zipped it closed. There was no farewell ceremony. There were no camera lenses recording that moment. There was only a man, a pair of shoes, and an unwitnessed ending, quietly closing a chapter that had once been his entire world, warming gradually, like the sun rising after a long night that seemed like it would never end. That is how Jay Williams' new journey began. Quietly, little by little, without any announcement ceremony, only a man learning to live again from the beginning. In 2008, he joined ESPN as a college basketball analyst, the first time sitting in front of the camera, no longer as an active player, but as someone sitting on the outside looking in. The feeling in him was so strange that it felt like wearing someone else's clothes, ill-fitting, unfamiliar. But gradually, through each recording session, each time on air, that unfamiliar feeling began to transform into something completely different. Real. He was learning a completely new language, not the language of feet gliding on the wooden floor or hands controlling the ball, but the language of analysis, of expression, of the ability to connect with millions of people through just voice and eyes. A set of skills completely foreign to a person who had spent a full 25 years of his life learning the language of sports. In 2016, he published his memoir titled "Life is Not an Accident," which landed on the New York Times bestseller list. For the first time, he publicly spoke about his painkiller addiction, about the years of depression, about the 2 times he had reached the edge of no longer wanting to live. The response from readers across America made him realize something both heavy and the most beautiful in his life. His story no longer belonged only to him. It had become the story of thousands of other people, people quietly fighting their own darkness. In 2021, he began hosting the podcast titled The Limits with Jay Williams on NPR, where he conversed with famous figures about how they overcame their own limits. There is a beautiful and also the most painful paradox in his entire journey. The person asking that question to others is the most vivid living answer to that very question. From 2019, he became part of the NBA Countdown program, analyzing the very league he had once been a part of, once dreamed of wearing the jersey for his entire career. He once thought that would be painful, would bring back everything that had been lost. But it was not as painful as he imagined, because he had become a different person, not a lesser version of the Jay Williams from back then, but a completely different person, with a new identity built from those very fragments. He continued to devote time to the Rising Stars Youth Foundation, to the consulting company Symmetry that he co-founded, to mentoring young athletes standing at crossroads where he himself had once stood. Not to build a new business empire, but to build meaning, something that money fame from back then had never truly brought him. There is a letter he received from a reader after the memoir was published that said, "I read your book while lying in a psychiatric hospital. It kept me here." Jay Williams kept that letter carefully, but did not place it on the shelf with the awards, medals, and other shining certificates. He placed it in a separate drawer, where he opened it every time he had difficult days, as a reminder that his pain, though once thought meaningless, could ultimately become light for others. In his first broadcast on ESPN, when sitting in front of the bright studio lights, he involuntarily remembered the lights of Cameron Indoor Stadium from back then, where his name had once been hung permanently high up. Two completely different kinds of lights shining on the same person. But that was no longer the old person from the past. That was a new Jay Williams, forged from the very losses, and gradually learning to shine in a completely different way. Deeply warm, not noisy, not perfect, but true to the smallest details. That is the happiness that Jay Williams finally found, a kind of happiness that he understood more clearly than anyone else, that it was not something everyone is given by default. Nicky Bonacorsi entered his life in 2015, at a time when he was no longer an NBA star at all, no longer the name called in the second overall position in the draft, no longer the Duke legend with the jersey hung from the Cameron Indoor Stadium ceiling. She met a man quietly rebuilding his life from fragments, a man still carrying scars both on his body and in his mind. And she chose that very man, not because of the halo of the past, but because of his quiet daily effort in the present. There is one important thing that needs to be said clearly. Nicky was not the person who came to save him. He had found his own way out of the darkness before meeting her. She was the person he chose to walk together with on that path, a subtle but extremely important difference between being saved and being accompanied. On Christmas Eve in 2017, at the One Hotel Brooklyn Bridge, he proposed to her. Not a flashy performance staged for the cameras, but a real moment between two real people, between the man who had once lain face down on the cold street of Chicago and the woman who had seen his true self behind all those stories. On May 3rd, 2018, they got married at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and on that very day, they announced the happy news that they were expecting a little angel. There is one thing that Jay Williams had carried in his heart for many years, a silent wound that few knew about. After the accident in 2003, the doctors had frankly told him that the possibility of him having children in the future was extremely slim. That was yet another thing taken from him on that fateful night, a loss he had quietly accepted for many years, not daring to hope too much. On October 10, 2018, Amelia Brooklyn Rose Williams was born. There is a detail that left even him silent when recalling it. He was born on September 10, 1981, but as a premature baby, arriving 1 month earlier than expected. His would-be birthday, according to the natural schedule, should have been October 10th. And his daughter, 37 years later, was born right on that very day. A circle of fate, or of something greater that he did not have enough words to name precisely. 3 years later, on April 9, 2021, their son Zane David Williams was born, carrying his own father's middle name, a deliberate continuation, a silent affirmation that his family's flow would never be broken again. The moment he first held Amelia in his arms was one of the most sacred moments of his life. The doctors had once said this might never happen, and now it was really happening. Right in his arms, much lighter than what he had imagined, but heavier than anything he had ever had to bear in his entire life. He could not say a word. He just stood there, letting the tears flow silently without needing any explanation, because there are emotions no words can fully describe. And there are evenings when he sits on the small chair in Amelia's room at their house in Brooklyn, reading a story to his daughter before bedtime, his voice low and steady echoing in that warm room. The man who had once lain in a hospital bed, not knowing if he could walk again, is now an ordinary father, doing the simplest thing any parent can do. And this is exactly what no $16 million contract could ever buy. Honest, without any embellishment, that is how Jay Williams chooses to talk about his life at 44 years old. Because after everything he has been through, he understands that the truth, even if not perfect, is always more valuable than any polished version. His left leg to this day has never fully returned to what it was before. He walks normally, can run, can play with his children, but the feeling inside is always different. A silent reminder that never completely disappears whenever the weather changes or after a long day of standing too much. And over time, he has learned not to want it to disappear anymore, because that very feeling is what reminds him of what he has been through, where he came from, and why every day lived like the present has so much meaning. Regarding mental health, he chooses to speak about it openly, not as a weakness to hide, but as part of the strength he has trained. Seeking psychological therapy is no longer something he hides in the darkness, but something he proactively shares in the hope that others quietly fighting with themselves will no longer have to hide like he once did for many years. A typical morning of his now looks very ordinary, waking up, brewing a cup of black coffee, skimming through the latest sports news, then preparing for his broadcast at ESPN. So ordinary that none of the people watching him every morning know that for many years, mornings like this were once the most difficult moments of his day, when he had to convince himself to find a reason to get out of bed. Recently, during a live broadcast of the NBA draft, two of his colleagues on television jokingly mentioned the motorcycle accident from years ago right in front of millions of viewers. Jay Williams later called that moment extremely uncomfortable, not because of personal pride, but because that wound had never truly closed completely, and the way people casually joked about someone's pain, even without ill intent, still reminded him that not everyone truly understands what happened behind that story. In his role mentoring young athletes, what he tries to convey is not playing technique or game tactics. What he wants them to understand is, know who you are when that sport is no longer by your side. Know that before life forces you to learn that lesson in the most painful way, as he himself once had to learn. Every morning, looking in the mirror at 44 years old, he no longer sees the young man who was the number 2 pick in the 2002 NBA draft. He also does not see a survivor of the accident, a title the media once gave him for many years. He only sees a father, a husband, a man trying to do something meaningful with what he has left. And for him, that is enough. In a recent interview, when asked about the night of June 19, 2003, he answered frankly, "I did not forgive myself right away. That is a job that must be done every day. And there are days that are still harder than others." Then he paused for a moment before adding, "But every day when I see Amelia and Zane, I understand why that job is worth continuing." Quiet and steady, like the sound of a bell still ringing after the echo has faded. That is how this story should close. The number 22 jersey is still hanging from the ceiling of Cameron Indoor Stadium and will remain there long after everything else has changed. The $16 million contract was spent many years ago. The glorious triple-double game against the New Jersey Nets is now just a line of statistics lying quietly in the sports database that few people still look up. Those things will still exist when Jay Williams is no longer here. But those are not what he wants people to remember him by. His true legacy lies in much more humble places. An old letter still carefully kept in a drawer from a person who once read his memoir right in a psychiatric hospital and said it kept her here with this life. The child who once cried on the Cameron Indoor Stadium wooden floor back then, now perhaps grown up, and who knows is telling that story to his own children. The young athletes he is guiding day by day, learning to understand who they are when their sport is no longer there, a lesson he himself had to pay a very high price to learn. And now, he wants to ask you, the person listening to this story, a question. Not the question of a successful person wanting to share a winning formula, but the question of a person who has once touched the deepest bottom, who knows clearly what that bottom looks like, feels like, how cold it is. Who will you become after the worst thing in your life truly happens? And now, please return to the image where we began, Jay Williams sitting in the analyst chair at ESPN, suit neatly pressed, the familiar smile that millions of Americans still see every morning. But now, you know where that smile truly comes from. It does not come from the NCAA championship in 2001. It does not come from the $1 million contract on the glorious draft night in 2002. It comes from some morning, many years ago, when a man decided to get out of bed even though he could not find any reason big enough to do so. And then he got up the next day, and the day after that. Like that, repeating until getting up became part of who he was, no longer a battle, but a habit of survival. That is not the smile of a successful person. That is the smile of a survivor. And the difference between those two things is exactly all that this story wants to tell you. If Jay Williams' journey makes you look back at your own wounds in life with a different eye, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. That is the simplest way to say that this story of survival deserves to be told further. Thank you for accompanying us. Until the very last second, see you in the next video, where another story about human resilience is waiting to be told.